You know what, Sly? Maybe you should be the one hosting this show, Jimmy said with a strained smile. We'll be back after the break, though I'm not sure you will. Before we dive into the story, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Did Jimmy do the right thing? Behind the door, the muffled sounds of the studio could be heard. The hum of equipment, footsteps of assistants, distant laughter from the audience, being warmed up by a comic. Sylvester looked at himself in the mirror, gray hair, deep wrinkles around his eyes. But his gaze was still sharp, like young Rocky's. He was 78, and though his body didn't obey like it once did, his mind remained sharp. He knew Jimmy liked to joke, but this time Sly wasn't here just to talk about old movies or laugh about his accent. He wanted to say something important about the America he had seen outside Hollywood, about the people whose voices were drowned out by loud headlines. The door opened, and a young assistant with an earpiece entered. Her name was Emily, skinny, with a nervous smile and a tablet in hand. "Mr. Stallone, we're ready in 5 minutes. Are you okay? Need anything? Water? Coffee?" Her voice was quick, almost mechanical. "I'm good, Emily. Just tell Jimmy not to joke too much about my old fights. I might accidentally hit him with a chair," Sly joked, winking. Emily laughed, but her laughter quickly faded when she glanced at the tablet. "By the way, he's planning to start with a question about the election. Are you ready for that?" Sylvester frowned. The 2024 election had split the country in two. Old friends stopped speaking. Families argued at holiday dinners, and social media exploded with insults. Sly wasn't a politician, but the injustice he saw irritated him. How regular people, workers, farmers, veterans, were being ignored while the elites fought for power. "I'm ready," he replied shortly, rising. His knees cracked, but he stood tall, shoulders back. Meanwhile, in the studio, Jimmy Kimmel stood backstage, holding a sheet of notes. He wore his usual suit, navy blue, slightly wrinkled, with a loosened tie. Jimmy loved his job, but lately, the jokes came harder. The audience expected sharp political jabs, but he knew every joke could alienate half the viewers. Tonight's guest, Sylvester Stallone, was a legend, but Jimmy had heard the rumors. Sly was ready to talk about something serious, not just promote another project. "You sure you want to start with politics?" asked his producer Rick, adjusting his glasses. "People love him for Rocky, not for speeches. If he talks, it'll be gold. If not, I'll get a few laughs out of him," Jimmy replied, though there was a note of doubt in his voice. The studio lights flashed on, the band played the opening theme, and Jimmy walked onto the stage to loud applause. The audience was full, mostly middle-aged people, many of whom remembered the 70s when Sly became a symbol of the American dream. Jimmy started with his monologue, a few jokes about California weather, a jab at Congress, a nod to the latest White House scandal. The crowd laughed, but the tension was there, the laughter slightly uneasy. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our main guest, the man who fought Apollo Creed, saved Vietnam, and still looks better than me at 78, Sylvester Stallone, Jimmy announced. Sly walked out to thunderous applause. He waved to the crowd, his wide smile glowing, but his eyes remained serious. He sat on the couch across from Jimmy, and the room fell silent, waiting for the first words. "Sly, great to see you," Jimmy began. "You just got back from Philly, right? How are things over there?" "Yeah, Jimmy. Philly is the heart of America, you know? But it's broken. I saw people working 12-hour shifts in factories, and their kids can't find jobs." "This isn't the country I remember," Sly replied, his voice low and firm. The room grew quiet. Jimmy leaned in slightly, sensing the conversation was heading off script. "You sound like a man who's got something to say. Let's talk about the election. What do you think is going on?" Jimmy tossed out the hook, hoping for a light joke. But Sly didn't smile. He looked straight into the camera, then at Jimmy. "I think we've all been played. It doesn't matter who won, red or blue. The people making the decisions don't walk the streets I've been on. They don't know what hopelessness smells like. And it pisses me off that anyone who tries to speak up becomes a target for mockery or outrage." The audience erupted into whispers. Jimmy felt sweat form at the back of his neck. This wasn't the Sly he expected. "Are you blaming the politicians?" Jimmy asked carefully. I'm blaming the system, Jimmy. And all of us for putting up with it in silence, Sly replied. But I'm not here to yell or throw punches. I want us to talk. A real conversation without shouting. Jimmy realized the show was slipping out of his control. He could crack a joke and steer it back to light territory, but something in Sly's eyes stopped him. Backstage, producer Rick was already waving his hands, signaling change the topic. But Jimmy ignored it. All right, Sly. Let's talk. What do you propose? He said, and for the first time that evening, his voice held genuine curiosity. Sly took a deep breath. He knew the next words could change everything, not just for him, but for the show, for the people in the studio, and the millions watching at home. And then something happened that shocked all of America. The room fell silent as Sylvester Stallone finished his sentence. The cameras zoomed in on his face. The wrinkles around his eyes deepened with tension, but his voice remained calm, almost hypnotic. Jimmy Kimmel sat across from him, nervously tapping a pen on the desk. He could feel sweat trickling down his back under his blue blazer. This was a moment where the show could either soar or explode live on air. And Jimmy decided to take the risk. All right, Sly, you want a real conversation, he began, leaning back in his chair with a faint smile. Then let's talk about what people actually care about. You mentioned the system screwing us over. But let's get specific. Do you think our politicians sold us out to China? Or are you one of those who believe taxes are strangling the middle class, while the rich swim in money? The question hung in the air, sharp as a knife. The audience murmured, whispers turning into muffled exclamations. These were the topics people 55 plus in the U.S. discussed every day, at gas stations, in churches, in grocery store lines. Jimmy knew he was hitting a nerve. Economic inequality and the fear of America's decline weren't just headlines to them. They were a part of life. Sly slowly leaned forward, placing his hands on his knees. His gaze pierced through Jimmy, and for a moment, the host no longer felt like the master of the stage, but a sparring partner in the ring. You want specifics? Fine, Sly began, his voice deeper now, with a touch of steel. I've seen factories in Philadelphia shut down, and people who worked there for 30 years left with nothing. Their pensions disappeared because someone in Washington signed a piece of paper to send the jobs overseas. Taxes? I pay more now than my father earned in his whole life, and the roads are still broken. Veterans are still sleeping on the streets. This isn't about red or blue, Jimmy. It's about all of us getting left behind. The crowd erupted in applause. A woman in the third row, wearing a faded Union logo jacket, stood up and shouted, "Tell 'em Sly." Jimmy felt his pulse quicken. He knew Sly was speaking a painful truth, but his job was to keep the show on track. He couldn't let the guest completely take over. You sound like a guy ready to run for president, Jimmy joked, trying to lighten the mood. The audience laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. But, seriously, Sly, you don't actually think it's that simple, do you? Some people might say you're just an old actor who's read too many newspapers. How do you prove this isn't just complaining? Sly didn't look away. He smiled slowly, but there was no warmth in it, only challenge. I'm not an actor right now, Jimmy. I'm someone who grew up in a rough neighborhood, where you either fight or fold. I don't read newspapers, I talk to people. The ones who lost their homes because the banks were playing games. The ones who can't afford medicine because insurance costs as much as their yearly salary. You want proof? Go outside after the show. Talk to them yourself. The audience exploded again, this time in cheering. Jimmy felt the ground shift beneath him. Sly wasn't just answering. He was taking over, turning the show into a platform. Behind the scenes, producer Rick was already running around waving his arms. And in Jimmy's earpiece, the director's voice barked. Change the topic. Now. But Jimmy didn't stop. He felt the audience on edge. And he was too. He leaned closer to Sly, his voice sharper now. You blame the banks, the politicians, the system. But what about us, Sly? We're the ones buying cheap Chinese clothes, watching Netflix, complaining on Twitter. Maybe we're the problem? Maybe you're just looking for a scapegoat. It was a low blow, and Jimmy knew it. The question struck a nerve for people 55 plus, their own role in the changes they despised. The room fell still, waiting for a reaction. Sly clenched his fists, but didn't stand up. His eyes gleamed like Rambo's before a fight, but his voice stayed calm, too calm. "You're right, Jimmy. We're all to blame. I buy those clothes. You make this show. But the difference is, I'm not hiding behind jokes. I'm standing here saying we can change this. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with conversation. Are you ready to listen, or are you going to keep laughing?" The silence in the studio became deafening. Jimmy felt his face burn. He realized he'd gone too far. Sly wasn't just responding. He was challenging not only him, but the entire glossy machinery of television. The audience began to clap, timidly at first, then louder. Jimmy glanced at the clock. 30 seconds to commercial break. He had to either save the moment or kick Sly off the stage. "You know what, Sly? Maybe you should be hosting this show," Jimmy said with a strained smile. "We'll be right back after the break, though I'm not sure if you will be." The audience gasped. The cameras pulled back, the lights dimmed, and the studio descended into chaos. Sly stood up, gave Jimmy a cold nod of respect, and walked off stage. Assistant Emily rushed after him, holding his coat, while the crowd began chanting, "Sly! Sly!" Jimmy remained seated, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knew he had just lost control, and that this was only the beginning. Backstage, Sly stopped, turned to Emily, and said quietly, "They haven't heard the real part yet." When the studio lights went out and the commercial break began, chaos erupted backstage. Producer Rick was yelling into his phone, demanding the director get the show back on track. Assistants were running everywhere, and Jimmy Kimmel sat at his desk, staring into the void. His heart pounded, and a single thought echoed in his mind. What have I just done? He had kicked Sylvester Stallone, a living legend, off the stage, and millions had seen it live. But something about Sly's calm gaze as he walked off wouldn't let Jimmy rest. This wasn't the end. Meanwhile, Sly stood backstage, holding a glass of water Emily had brought him. His broad shoulders were tense, but his face remained unreadable. Emily, trembling with nerves, whispered, "Mr. Stallone, are you going back? They say the show might get canceled because of this." Sly looked at her, his eyes softening. "Emily, I'm not leaving. I haven't said what matters yet." He set the glass down and headed out, not to the dressing room, but toward the main lobby, where the overflow audience had been waiting. When the commercials ended, Jimmy forced a smile into the camera. The band started playing, but the music sounded uneasy. The crowd murmured, people were checking their phones, whispering, some already standing up. "Welcome back." Jimmy began, his voice shaky. "Well, that was an interesting turn." "Huh?" Sly seems to have decided he needed a break, but He didn't finish. The doors at the back of the studio burst open, and in walked Sly, no mic, no entourage, just his coat draped over his arm. Behind him trailed a crowd, dozens of people from the lobby, security guards, janitors, a few elderly fans with standing room tickets. All of them looked at Sly with reverence. "Sly." Jimmy stood, his eyes wide. "What are you doing?" Stallone stopped center stage, scanning the room. The cameras hurried to catch up, the operators barely keeping pace. He raised his hand, signaling for silence, and began to speak, unamplified. Yet his voice thundered like it did in his prime. "Jimmy, I wasn't finished. You kicked me out because I told a truth you didn't like. But I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to talk to them." He pointed to the audience, to the people sitting there, mouths agape. Jimmy tried to cut in. "Sly, this is my show, you can't just—" "It's not your show, Jimmy." Sly cut him off sharply. "It's their show, their lives, and I want them to hear what I've seen." He turned to the crowd, and in that moment, something incredible happened. An older woman stepped out from the people behind him, frail, in a worn coat, hands trembling. Her name was Martha, and she'd been one of those waiting for Sly in the lobby. She approached him, holding a yellowed photograph. "Mr. Stallone," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "This is my son. He was a veteran. He died 2 years ago because he couldn't afford insulin. You spoke about him. In Philadelphia, right?" The room fell silent. Sly took the photo, looked at it, a young man in uniform, beaming. His eyes shimmered with tears, but he held them back. "Yes, Martha. I talked about him. and about all those who've lost someone because of this system. He turned back to Jimmy, his voice now low, but piercing. That's what I wanted to say, Jimmy. We can shout, laugh, or throw each other off stage. But if we don't start listening to people like Martha, we'll lose everything. Jimmy stood frozen. His throat tightened. The cameras caught his face in a close-up, pale, bewildered. He realized the show was no longer his. But instead of anger, something else bloomed inside him, shame and understanding. Sly, he began, but the words caught. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He dropped his mic, stepped off the stage, and walked over to Martha. Tell me about your son. The room exploded. People stood, applauding, crying. Martha, trembling, began to speak about her son who served in Iraq, his fight with diabetes, the unanswered letters to insurance companies. Sly stood beside her, listening, while the crowd from the lobby, ordinary people usually kept off camera, quietly joined them on stage. It wasn't just a television moment. It was a rupture. The live feed was abruptly cut. Some panicked producer pulled the plug, but the in-studio cameras kept rolling. The footage spread instantly across the internet. Sly returning with the crowd, Jimmy dropping the mic, Martha telling her story. The next day's headline screamed, Stallone and Kimmel Shock America, the show that changed everything. The following morning, Jimmy sat in his dressing room, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His phone buzzed nonstop, messages from colleagues, friends, even politicians demanding an explanation. But he could only think of one thing. Slice words. We can change this. He turned on the TV. Every channel was replaying that moment where he stepped down to Martha. The ratings had skyrocketed, but Jimmy didn't care. He felt something more, an elation he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, his show had become more than entertainment. Meanwhile, Sly sat in his hotel, looking out the window at Los Angeles. On the table lay the photo of Martha's son. She had given it to him after the show. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt it. A small step had been taken. People had listened. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin